Haunting vision. The events of the previous night clung to Emily's mind like cobwebs as she and Alice reluctantly returned to their room after breakfast. The tension between them was palpable. Alice had barely spoken, her movements sharp and hurried as she packed her things, muttering about leaving. Emily couldn't blame her. If not for the nagging pull of curiosity, Emily might have agreed to leave the castle behind without looking back. But something about Ballygally Castle refused to let her go. The whispers, the locked room, and the pale figure in the dark all seemed to weave together into an unfinished story. And now, more than ever, she wanted answers. By mid-afternoon, the oppressive weight of exhaustion took hold. The lack of sleep from the previous nights made Emily's eyelids heavy, her thoughts sluggish. Alice was in the lounge, avoiding the eerie stillness of their room. Emily stretched out on the bed, intending only to rest her eyes for a moment. Sleep claimed her almost instantly, pulling her down into a dreamscape so vivid it felt more real than the waking world. Emily stood in a stone room. The air was damp, carrying the scent of mildew and despair. The narrow space was lit by a single flickering candle, its weak light casting jagged shadows on the walls. She turned slowly, her fingers brushing against the rough, cold stone. There was no furniture, no signs of life, only the oppressive silence of abandonment. And then she heard it, a soft, muffled sobbing, the sound of a woman in despair. Emily's heart raced as she followed the sound, her bare feet moving soundlessly across the icy floor. She turned a corner, and there she was. The woman sat huddled on the ground, her once elegant dress tattered and stained. Her long, dark hair hung in limp, tangled strands, and her thin arms clutched a bundle to her chest. Though her face was obscured, her sorrow filled the room like a tangible force. "Lady Isabella," Emily whispered, the name slipping from her lips unbidden. At the sound of her name, the woman's head snapped up, revealing wide, tear-filled eyes. Her face was pale and gaunt, her lips trembling as she opened her mouth to speak. But no words came. Instead, she let out a heart-wrenching wail that echoed through the chamber, carrying with it the weight of centuries of pain. The walls seemed to respond, shuddering with a low, grinding groan. Dust fell from the ceiling as the room began to close in on itself, the stone shifting and creaking. Isabella's cries grew louder, more frantic, as the bundle in her arms started to stir. Emily moved closer, her instinct screaming at her to help, though she didn't know how. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice shaking. "They've taken him," Isabella sobbed, clutching the bundle tighter. "My child, my baby boy." Emily knelt beside her, the chill of the stone seeping into her skin. "Who took him?" Isabella's gaze darted toward the door, her eyes filled with terror. "Him," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He said I was unfit, that I would ruin him. He locked me here to wither away while he—" A deafening crash cut her off. The door burst open, slamming against the wall with a force that sent shards of wood flying. A towering man stepped into the room, his face shadowed but his presence suffocating. He carried an air of cold authority, his movements deliberate and cruel. Michael Shaw. Emily breathed, though she didn't know how she recognized him. "You'll not corrupt the boy with your weakness," Michael spat, his voice like the grinding of iron. He took a step forward, and Isabella recoiled, clutching the bundle as though it were her lifeline. "He's my son," Isabella cried, her voice breaking. "You can't take him from me." Michael's laughter was low and humorless. "He's my heir. He belongs to me, as do you." He reached down, his gloved hand closing around Isabella's arm with a grip so tight it made her cry out. Emily moved to intervene, her hands shooting out to shove him away, but her fingers passed through him like smoke. She gasped, stumbling back as she realized she was powerless in this place, a mere observer to the horrors unfolding before her. Michael yanked Isabella to her feet, her frail body no match for his brute strength. The bundle fell from her arms, and Emily's stomach twisted as it landed on the stone floor with a hollow thud. She reached for it instinctively, but when she turned it over, it was empty. No baby, just a faded piece of fabric, its edges frayed and worn. No, Isabella screamed, clawing at Michael's arm. Give him back. Please give him back. Michael's expression remained cold, devoid of pity. You'll rot here, Isabella, forgotten and alone. With that, he threw her toward the far wall. She crumpled to the ground, her sobs echoing in the tightening space as Michael turned and strode out of the room. The door slammed shut behind him, plunging the chamber into darkness. For a moment, the silence was absolute. Then came the scratching. Faint at first, it grew louder, more frantic, as though dozens of claws were scraping against the walls. Emily pressed herself against the cold stone, her heart pounding as the sound closed in from all sides. Isabella's sobs faded, replaced by a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. Emily turned toward where the woman had fallen, but she was no longer there. Instead, a shadowy figure loomed in her place, its form shifting and writhing like smoke caught in a storm. The figure turned toward Emily, and she felt its gaze pierce through her. Its eyes burned with an unnatural light, and its mouth twisted into a ghastly grin. Run, it hissed, its voice a chilling echo that reverberated through Emily's very bones. She didn't need to be told twice. Emily scrambled to her feet and bolted for the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The wall seemed to close in on her, the space shrinking as the scratching grew deafening. She reached the door and threw herself against it, but it wouldn't budge. The shadow was closing in now, its form stretching and elongating, its laughter ringing in her ears. Emily clawed at the door, desperate to escape, but it was as though the castle itself was holding her prisoner. Just as the shadow's hand reached out to engulf her, a blinding light filled the room, and Emily woke with a start. Her chest heaved as she sat up in bed, drenched in sweat. The room was quiet, the only sound the faint rustling of the wind outside. Alice was still asleep, her form motionless under the covers. For a moment, Emily thought she might have imagined the whole thing, but then she glanced down at her hand. There, clutched tightly in her fingers, was a piece of frayed fabric, its edges worn and faded. Phantom's cry. The morning sunlight streamed weakly through the narrow window of their room, but it did little to dispel the oppressive atmosphere of the castle. Emily sat at the writing desk, the scrap of fabric from her dream lying before her like an accusation. She hadn't told Alice about it yet. She wasn't sure how. Every time she tried to bring it up, her words dried up, as though the memory itself resisted being spoken aloud. Alice, for her part, had seemed intent on ignoring the previous night's events. She insisted on visiting the castle library to look for books about its history. Emily suspected it was less about research and more about avoiding their room, but she didn't argue. Anything to keep Alice from fleeing the castle entirely. It was just past noon when Alice first heard the sound. She had been pacing the library, scanning the dusty shelves for anything remotely useful, when a faint, high-pitched cry cut through the silence. At first, she thought she'd imagined it, an auditory trick of the castle's many drafts. But then it came again, clearer this time, the unmistakable wail of a baby. Alice froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound didn't belong in this place. The library, with its towering bookshelves and faded tapestries, was suffocatingly silent. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the dim corners for the source of the noise. Emily, she called, her voice barely above a whisper. But Emily wasn't there. She'd gone back to their room to collect her notebook, leaving Alice alone in the library. The crying came again, louder now, and Alice's pulse quickened. It seemed to be coming from somewhere nearby, but no matter where she turned, she couldn't pinpoint its source. The sound was strange, unnatural even. It didn't ebb and flow like a real child's cry. Instead, it was constant, relentless, a sound that burrowed into her skull and made her teeth ache. Alice took a hesitant step toward the door, her footsteps echoing on the stone floor. The crying continued, leading her down the hall and toward the staircase that spiraled up to the turret. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs, her stomach churning. The turret. It was the one place she had sworn she wouldn't go again. But the sound persisted, tugging at her with a strange urgency. Against her better judgment, she began to climb. The air grew colder as Alice ascended the narrow staircase, her hand trailing along the rough stone wall for balance. The crying seemed to grow louder with each step, echoing off the walls in a way that made it impossible to tell where it was coming from. By the time she reached the top, her heart was pounding in her chest, and her hands were clammy with sweat. The turret room was as she remembered it, small, barren, and suffused with an unnatural chill. The single slit of a window cast a pale beam of light across the floor, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air. But the room wasn't empty. In the center of the floor, a cradle sat, rocking gently back and forth as though moved by an invisible hand. Alice stopped in the doorway, her breath catching. The cradle was old, antique, even, with a wooden frame worn smooth by time. Its presence was impossibly wrong. It hadn't been there the last time they'd visited the turret, and there was no way anyone could have carried it up the narrow staircase without her noticing. The crying was louder now, coming from the cradle itself. Alice took a hesitant step forward, her legs trembling beneath her. She didn't want to look. Every instinct screamed at her to turn and run, to leave the castle behind and never look back. But something stronger pulled her forward. When she reached the cradle, she hesitated, her hand hovering above the edge. The crying had stopped. The silence was almost worse. It pressed down on her like a weight, suffocating and absolute. Slowly, she peered inside. The cradle was empty. Alice stumbled back, her chest tightening as panic set in. Her mind raced to make sense of what she'd seen, or hadn't seen. She turned to leave, but as she did, a voice stopped her in her tracks. "Why did you leave me?" It was soft and faint, like a whisper carried on the wind, but it was unmistakably a child's voice. Alice spun around, her eyes wide with terror. The room was empty, but the voice came again, this time closer. "Why did you leave me, Mother?" A shadow moved in the corner of the room, just beyond the reach of the light. Alice's breath hitched as she watched it coalesce into a form. A small boy, no older than 5, dressed in clothes that seemed centuries out of place. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were wide and unblinking. Alice backed away, her hand gripping the edge of the cradle for support. "I'm not your mother," she stammered, her voice trembling. "I'm not." The boy tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "She left me," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "She said she would come back, but she didn't." "I don't know what you mean," Alice whispered, her heart pounding. She glanced toward the doorway, calculating how quickly she could make her escape. The boy took a step forward, his bare feet making no sound on the stone floor. "You'll stay with me," he said, his voice tinged with a quiet desperation. "You won't leave. Promise me." Alice shook her head, her back pressing against the wall. "I can't, I have to go." The boy's expression darkened, his features twisting into something cruel and unrecognizable. "You'll stay," he hissed, his voice rising to a deafening pitch. The cradle flew across the room, slamming into the wall with a force that sent splinters flying. The window shattered, and a cold wind howled through the room, carrying with it the faint sound of Isabella's scream. Emily found Alice in the hallway at the base of the turret stairs, her face pale and her hands trembling. She was sitting on the floor, her back against the wall, staring blankly ahead. "Alice!" Emily cried, rushing to her side. "What happened? Are you okay?" Alice didn't respond at first. Her eyes slowly focused on Emily, and she opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, she shook her head and buried her face in her hands. Emily helped her to her feet, her mind racing with questions. But as she glanced toward the turret, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The cradle was back. It sat at the top of the staircase, its frame intact, rocking gently in the breeze that carried the faint sound of a child's cry. Historical discovery. The library at Ballygally Castle was a grand yet oppressive space, its towering bookshelves stretching to the arched ceiling like skeletal fingers. Dust hung thick in the air, and the faint scent of parchment and decay lingered in every corner. The room was lit by a series of antique wall sconces, their dim flames barely enough to chase away the heavy shadows. Connor O'Leary, a local historian, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses as he flipped through a crumbling ledger. He had spent years documenting the murky histories of Northern Ireland's haunted places, but Ballygally Castle had always been an enigma. Now, sitting in its ancient library, he felt as though he were on the verge of uncovering something monumental. The castle's written records were as fragmented as its crumbling walls. Half of the ledgers were illegible. Their ink faded to pale ghosts of letters. Others had been partially consumed by mold, leaving jagged black scars across their pages. Connor sifted through them methodically, his gloved hands careful not to damage the delicate paper. Hours passed in silence. He was about to give up when his fingers brushed against a hidden compartment at the base of one of the shelves. The panel slid back with a soft click, revealing a small leather-bound journal. Its cover was embossed with an ornate design, and though it was worn, the name etched across its surface was unmistakable: Michael Shaw. Connor's pulse quickened. He carried the journal to a nearby desk, lighting a candle to illuminate its fragile pages. The handwriting within was angular and precise, the ink surprisingly well preserved. It began with a date, 1641, and an entry that made Connor's breath hitch. October 3rd, 1641. They do not understand. My wife weeps, her feeble heart broken by the child's cries, but she is blind to the greater purpose. The boy is my legacy, my immortality. I will not allow him to grow weak under her indulgent care. A man is forged in fire, not coddled in warmth. The alchemist in Carrickfergus has opened my eyes to truths beyond the veil of mortal comprehension. He speaks of transmutation, not of gold, but of the soul. A man need not submit to the ravages of time. I will become eternal, unshackled by death. For this, the child must be protected from the taint of his mother's weakness. She has served her purpose, but her influence ends now. Connor leaned back in his chair, the words swimming before his eyes. The implications were horrifying. Lady Isabella's imprisonment had not been an act of cruelty born from jealousy, as local legends suggested. It had been calculated, a deliberate effort to sever her connection to her son. He flipped through the journal, his hands trembling. Each entry painted a picture of a man descending into madness, consumed by a desire for control and immortality. Michael Shaw's obsession with alchemy and the occult had driven him to seek the ultimate defiance of nature. November 17th, 1641. The ritual is almost complete. The alchemist has provided the tinctures, and the sigils are drawn. The boy will be the key, a vessel through which I will channel my will. Isabella remains in the turret, her cries growing weaker each day. She prays for salvation, but none will come. Her faith will not shield her from the inevitable. Tomorrow, I will take what is mine. The boy will be freed from her influence, and my work will begin. Connor's mouth went dry. The ritual Michael referred to wasn't just a metaphor. There were detailed sketches in the journal, diagrams of circles filled with symbols, annotated with phrases in Latin. Though Connor wasn't fluent, he recognized enough to understand their intent. These were invocations, spells designed to bind and manipulate life itself. At the back of the journal was a folded parchment. Carefully, Connor opened it, revealing a hand-drawn map of the castle. It was crude but detailed, marking several locations he recognized immediately. The turret, the dining hall, and, most chillingly, a room beneath the castle that didn't appear on any modern blueprints. The hidden room was labeled in bold, jagged letters. Crypta Vitae, the crypt of life. Connor stared at the map, a sense of dread curling in his stomach. He had to find this crypt. If the journal's claims were true, then the answers to Ballygally Castle's haunting might lie within. The descent. Connor found Emily and Alice in the library shortly after. Emily had just returned from their room, her expression tight with worry, while Alice sat slumped in a chair, her face pale. "Connor," Emily said, standing as he approached. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Connor gave a grim chuckle. "I may have found one." He held up the journal, its cracked leather catching the candlelight. "This belonged to Michael Shaw." Emily's eyes widened. "You're kidding. What does it say?" Connor hesitated. A lot. Too much, maybe. He wasn't just some cruel nobleman. He was obsessed with alchemy, immortality. He thought his son was the key. Alice, who had been silent until now, looked up sharply. What do you mean, the key? Connor sighed and explained what he'd read, carefully omitting the darker details. By the time he finished, Alice was gripping the arms of her chair, her knuckles white. So what? He performed some dark ritual and cursed the whole place? Alice asked, her voice laced with sarcasm, but tinged with fear. Maybe, Connor said. There's more. The journal mentions a crypt beneath the castle, a hidden room. I think we need to find it. Emily nodded, her curiosity overcoming her fear. Where is it? Connor unfolded the map and pointed to a spot near the base of the castle. If this map is accurate, there's an entrance near the dining hall. Alice groaned. You're not seriously thinking of going down there, are you? We need answers, Emily said firmly. If Michael Shaw really did something unnatural, it might explain everything that's been happening. Connor and Emily's determination left Alice with little choice. Reluctantly, she followed them as they made their way toward the dining hall. The castle was eerily silent, its usual creaks and groans absent, as though it were holding its breath. They found the hidden entrance exactly where the map indicated, a loose stone panel at the base of the wall. Behind it was a narrow passage that sloped downward, its walls lined with ancient, rusted sconces. The air grew colder as they descended, and the faint scent of earth and decay filled their nostrils. At the end of the passage was a heavy iron door. It bore the same symbols Connor had seen in the journal, etched deep into its surface. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle. Are you sure about this? Alice asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Connor didn't answer. He pushed the door open, its hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The crypt of life. The room was circular, its walls carved with intricate symbols and glyphs. In the center stood an ornate stone altar, its surface stained dark with something Connor didn't want to identify. Surrounding the altar were broken shards of glass, remnants of what might have once been vials or jars. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the faint hum of energy made the hairs on Connor's arms stand on end. Emily stepped forward, her flashlight sweeping over the walls. It's like something out of a nightmare. Connor nodded, his gaze fixed on the altar. As he approached, he noticed something carved into its base. Pro animarum immortalite, for the immortality of souls. Alice stood frozen at the doorway, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. I hate this. I hate all of this. Before anyone could respond, a low, guttural sound echoed through the room. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, resonating in their chests. The temperature plummeted, and the light from their flashlights began to flicker. Connor turned toward the sound, his heart pounding. From the shadows beyond the altar, a figure began to emerge.
The deep house track with the haunting melody from echoing synths to a driving beat with a driving bass. Don't stop the deep house track with the